Today we're talking about J. Cole's new album, For Your Eyes Only. J. Cole got a head start on his career back in 2009 when he was picked up by artist Jay-Z, one of the biggest rappers, and he was actually featured on one of his albums. Jay-Z found Cole to be so talented that he offered him a contract with his personal record label, Roc Nation. And the rest is history. J. Cole's new album is his fourth studio album after Cold World, Born Sinner, and 2014 Forest Hills Drive. And the thing is that all of these albums have gotten some really positive critics, so it just gives us an extra incentive to check out his music if we haven't checked it out from before. To be honest, I haven't listened much to his music myself, but after listening to this album right here, man, I'm interested. And the reason why I got so interested and intrigued to check out more of J. Cole's stuff is because this album is just so classical, yet at the same time very original. It's novel, but at the same time very conformed as well. And I've mentioned this mix of something new and something old in many of my other reviews as well. I think hitting this sweet spot between familiarity and novelty is one of the big staples within music that actually makes music listenable and enjoyable. J. Cole was absolutely successful at hitting that sweet spot on this album. Cole displays a very orchestral sound on several of the tracks. You can hear violins, trumpets, cellos, guitars, pianos on tracks like For Your Eyes Only, For Whom the Bell Tolls, what was that last track? Ville Mentality and She's Mine Part 1 and 2. All of these tracks have a rich variety of instruments. Mix that together with Cole's rock-solid rapping and his meaningful lyrics, and you find yourself taking a beautiful, revealing, and impactful journey into the mind of the artist. That is probably the best way I can describe this album in a nutshell. It's an amazing journey where Cole is inviting us into his mind, where he's sharing his stories, his experiences of his hardships of growing up without a father, of becoming a father himself, having his friends going to jail, having his friends dying, dealing drugs. He also talks about life and death. This is a very deep album that you can look very deeply into and kind of mesmerize yourself for hours with. Throughout the whole album, Cole is sharing all of these different aspects in a very vulnerable and heartfelt way, which makes me think about the album as genius in general, because we can all relate to these subjects. We can all relate to hardships in life. So it's very easy for us to kind of get impacted by this record. We all know that life is hard at times, just like how he's portraying it in the song Ville Mentality. In this song, Cole describes his life in the spotlight as being filled with trials and tribulations because so many n***s and b***s want a piece of him. They're always calling his phone up because they want to have a piece of his fame, or they want a piece of him in one way or another, right? And because of this, he says that he always needs to keep his guard up. If you, for example, listen to the bridge, he continuously raps, give up my pride, never, show him my pain, never, dirt on my name, never. So he's kind of keeping his guard up all the time. And the reason why he wants to keep himself so guarded might be because he is finding himself in time of being very vulnerable because he's going through a transition in life. He is becoming a father. I've never experienced becoming a father myself, but I can imagine it being one of the biggest pivotal transitions ever in life, and it can probably also be the most exhausting thing that you can ever experience. I don't know, for some reason the only thing that I can think about is one of these David Lynch movies. Ugh. If you further listen to the other lyrics on this album, you also find out that Cole grew up most of his childhood without a father himself, and that is probably making it a whole lot harder for him to become a father himself because he never learned how a good father is like, what a good father is like. If you listen to the track Ville Mentality that I just talked about, there are some interludes in between in the song where this little girl shares her story, which is kind of similar to J. Cole's story. She explains how her father was set up and murdered by his friends, and how she would, after his funeral, just get really mad at her mom, go and lock herself up at her room and sit there completely alone with this big emotional turmoil that she's experiencing inside. And what happens when you become so emotionally damaged as a child is that you become very hostile, you put up emotional barriers so that you don't get hurt again, and you become very protective of yourself. And I think that is what Cole is trying to emphasize throughout this song, and maybe several tracks on this album, that he is trapped in this Ville mentality. He is trapped in this very overprotective mentality. He is kind of a slave to it. Some people also think that Cole is contemplating on quitting his musical career altogether because of this inner conflict, but who knows? This album is good, so he shouldn't. Anyways, that was a very, very big segment on the background story of one of the tracks on this album. But trust me, this album is very deep. You can go very deep into many of the tracks. There's so many stories. There's like one story for each and every track on this album. And it's very inspiring to just sit and listen and trying to dig a little bit deeper. At least that is what I think. In addition to the lyrics, sonically, this album sounds pretty amazing as well. There are so many different instruments, as I mentioned before, the cellos, the guitars, the pianos, the almost jazz-inspired tracks, beats. I just love them. And these jazz-inspired, very instrumentally rich songs are kind of melded together with more electronically and beat-centered songs as well. So what you end up with is this very lofty conglomeration of an album that you willingly sit through from start to finish, which is awesome. Now, after being very generous with the words that I used to describe this album, I have to say that you need to take it with a pinch of salt, because during the first few listens, when I listened to this album, I just didn't get into the album very quickly. I needed to listen to it for 2, 3 times, 4 times before I actually got into the album, and that is when I started to really, really like it a lot. It was like an exponential liking curve, if that makes sense. I had a hard time getting into the album, but it started to grow on me. So for me, this album is a grower. It needs investment, it needs your time in order to become good. At least that's what I experienced. After listening to it for many, many times, I think this album is an enrichment on just so many different levels. The only thing that I find a little bit negative is that it needs a bit of spice, a bit of pepper. It lacks that little extra thing that would make it stick out a little bit more. As mentioned before, there are just so many concepts that are being brought up on this album, like life, death, fame, God, drug dealing, racism. So many different things are being dealt with here. And if Cole had managed to string all of these things better together, if he had created a more consistent album with a more coherent theme, focused more on just a few of these topics, I think the record could have come off a little bit stronger. And yeah, that is basically it. It was an amazing record. Go and check it out. I would give it a 7 out of 10. Go and check it out, or you'll be missing out. Alright? What do you guys think about this record? Leave a comment below to share your feelings and your thoughts about it. I would love to hear your opinions. And also, what would you like me to review next time? I would love to get an answer to those questions, guys. And I hope to see you later. Stay tuned. Bye. Show off these guns. These guns. Excuse me.